but we could not complete it yesterday, so we'll try to complete it today. Okay, so the question here says, have a look at this. In 2002, in the UK public sector, firefighters threatened to go on strike because they stated that their earnings were very low compared with other workers. In the same year, Robbie Williams, a singer from the UK, signed the largest ever recording deal in the music industry worth millions of pounds. Discuss whether economic theory of wages can explain how workers in a vital industry such as firefighting service can have lower pay than workers in a less vital industry such as entertainment, right? Okay. Now, the question here is simply asking for you to explain the concept of wage differential. Now, what's wage differential, Bri? Now, if you remember, we talked about that what determines wages, right? So there are two factors, two most important factors, which is demand and supply, right? So both of these two factors collectively determine the wages in the market, right? And therefore, we need to explain both of these two to explain that why firefighters earn less compared to singers, right? We got on this? Okay. Now, have a look at this. So the answer would be, just a second. Okay, now here's the thing. Okay, so first of all, define how wages are determined in free market. Now, what are free markets? You would already know that free markets are labor markets where governments do not intervene, and there's no existence of trade unions, or there are no other external factors that determine wages. So it's only the two market forces of demand and supply that determine wages in the market, right? So that's what free markets are, right? Define how wages are determined in free markets. So first of all, define labor demand, which we'll do it together. Just give me a second. And then you have to define labor supply, right? So I'm also giving you a roadmap over here. So first, what's labor demand? Labor demand is to total that is demanded by a firm at different wage rates, right? Now think about this. What is labor demand? First of all, you can also start off by the idea that labor demand is derived demand. Now, what do we mean by derived demand? Derived demand means that you demand labor because that produces something else that you need to sell to your customers. Now, think about this. Why would an online teaching platform want to hire teachers? Because teaching services is what they sell. So if they don't have teachers, they can't sell online teaching services. Is this making sense, right? So first of all, you can perhaps start off from here. Is derived demand, which means labor is demanded to produce and services are sold to customers for else a business. This is making sense, right? So after you've explained all of this, then you have to say that what exactly labor demand means. Labor demand refers to the total quantity, that is being demanded by a firm at different wage rates, right? Now, what is labor demand made up of, Preet? So if you remember, we talked about this in detail. So labor demand is based on marginal revenue product of labor. Now, what is marginal revenue product of labor? Let's do a quick recap over here. So marginal revenue product of labor is basically how much additional revenue would each labor contribute? How much additional revenue would each labor contribute for the firm, right? So you would have a look at this. So you would have marginal revenue product of labor on the y-axis, and you will have quantity of labor on the x-axis. Now, we do know the concept of diminishing marginal product. Now, what is diminishing marginal product? Diminishing marginal product means that each additional unit of labor will produce less output. How do we know this, right? So if you remember, we made a table where we saw that each additional unit of labor contributes less output. So on the left column, you can have units of labor, like how many units of labor is company hiring. And on the right hand side, you will have marginal product, which means additional unit that each unit of labor will contribute, right? Marginal product. Okay, so if you want to also look at the formula of marginal product, let me write that down for you. So marginal product would be on the right hand side. So marginal product of labor, which we short form as MPL, so that's simply equal to change in total output divided by change in labor. So how much will be the change in output of the firm due to hiring of one more unit of labor? So change in total output divided by change in labor is your marginal product of labor, right? Now, if you remember, when we made this table, we saw that when you hire the first unit of labor, let's say, and this is a factory that's manufacturing anything, perhaps t-shirts, right? So after hiring the first unit of labor, the total output of the firm is, let's say, 100 units, right? 100 t-shirts per day, per week, could be anything, right? So let's say that's 100 t-shirts, right? Then when you hire the second unit of labor, your total output increases to 180 units, right? So your total output increases to 180 units. When you hire the third unit of labor, your total output increases to 240. When you hire the fourth unit, sorry, your total output increases to 280. In fact, this is not marginal product. Sorry, my bad. This is not marginal product that I'm writing on top. Instead, I'm writing total product because this is the total output that is being produced with different units of labor. So this is total. This is technically total output, right? And then you can add another column over here, which would list your marginal product. So let me get rid of this, right? Now for the marginal product, all you have to do is to take the difference, right? What you have to do is to take the difference. Okay, now think about this. So when you hired the first unit of labor, that person on his own produced how many units of the good? That person produced 100 t-shirts, so 100 units of the good, right? So the marginal product of the first guy was 100. Then for the second guy, the total output increased from 100 to 180, which means that this guy on his own contributed 80 units to the output. Then the third guy on his own contributed how much units to the output? You take the difference. 240 minus 180 is 60, right? So this guy contributed 60 units to the output, and then the fourth guy contributed 40 units to the output. This is making sense, right? So this is your marginal product. And now what we are seeing over here, that your marginal product is diminishing. As your units of labor are increasing, each additional unit of labor is contributing less to output. Yes or no? Each additional unit of labor is contributing less to output. We got on this? Okay. Now have a look at this. Marginal revenue product of labor is basically a downward sloping curve. Now, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention here, what's the difference? Do you remember the difference between marginal product of labor and marginal revenue product of labor? Because these two are different terms. So you have to be careful as to what you're writing in your answer and what you're referring to, right? So one is marginal product of labor and the other one is marginal revenue product of labor. So marginal product of labor just mentions the units of labor that each additional unit of labor is producing, units of output that each additional unit of labor is producing, right? And yes, exactly, excellent, right? Whereas the marginal revenue product of labor refers to the revenue that each additional unit of labor is contributing. Marginal revenue, marginal revenue, marginal revenue product of labor refers to additional revenue, right? I'll write down. So if you think of the formulas for the two, right? So in this case, the short form of marginal product of labor is just MPL, and MPL is equals to change in output, right? Divided by change in labor, right? So how many additional units of output which will each unit of labor produce, right? So that's how you calculate marginal product of labor. On the other hand, marginal revenue product of labor is written as, the short form for this is MRPL. MRPL, and it's basically change in revenue. It's change in revenue So that is change in revenue divided by change in labor. Okay, are we getting this? Okay. Now, this being said, so when you multiply, very simply speaking, when you multiply the marginal product of labor with the price of the good, when you multiply this column, marginal product of labor, with the price of the good, you get marginal revenue product of labor. So simply speaking, MPL times the price per unit of the good is price per unit of the good is equivalent to, that gives you marginal revenue product of labor. Is this making sense? So that's all what you need to remember here. Easy, we good? Okay, now coming back, the graph, the demand curve for labor is not the marginal product of labor, but instead it is, just give me a second, Preet. But instead it is, sorry about that. Just a second. Okay, sorry about this. Okay, so I was saying that the demand curve for labor is not the marginal product of labor, but instead it is marginal revenue product of labor, right? So it's a normal downward sloping curve. It's a normal downward sloping curve like this, right? So that's how it looks like, right? And you call it marginal revenue product of labor. Easy, right? Okay, just a second. Okay, now think about this. So it's a downward sloping curve, and this is the demand curve for labor, marginal revenue, product of labor. Okay, now the idea is that what does it show? That's the thing that we need to understand. So it means that as you increase your units of labor, so if I choose some random points on this demand curve, right? So let's say this is point A, this is point B, this is point C, right? So if you look at these, what you will see that, let's say the first unit of labor was contributing the highest in revenue. That's why it's on the highest point on the demand curve, right? So on the x-axis, you have units of labor, quantity of labor, as you can see for yourself, quantity of labor, and on the y-axis, you have marginal revenue product of labor, right? So the first labor on his own contributed how much to the company's revenue? The first guy on his own contributed $500 to the company's revenue. Then the second guy on his own contributed, let's say something less, could be 450, could be 400, but smaller than or less than the first guy, right? $450, let's say, right? And then the third guy on his own contributed even lesser, and that was, let's say, $200. Is this making sense, Preet? Okay. Now, this being said, now how is this your demand curve as well? Now, this was the tricky part. Now, how is your marginal revenue? Because so far, this curve is showing you the revenue that each unit of labor is contributing. So my question is that how is this your demand curve for labor? So this is your demand curve for labor because if a guy is contributing $500 to your revenue, then would any company be willing to pay this person something more than $500? Right? So here's my question. So how is this marginal revenue product of labor the demand curve for labor? So I'm saying that this is your demand curve for labor because of the fact that if a unit of labor is contributing this much unit of this much amount of revenue to the company, then no business would want to give this person anything more than $500 in wages. So that's the max that they would want to pay to this person. Is this making sense, right? Right. So if I replace, that being said, so if I replace on the y-axis, or I just write this down as, marginal revenue product of labor slash wages. So this is how it becomes the demand curve, because this is the maximum amount that, firms would be willing to pay to each unit of the labor. Is making sense, right? Okay. Now this is the firm demand curve, right? Which I did tell you that it is, it shows the total quantity of labor that, it shows the total quantity of labor that a firm is willing to hire at different wage rates. So that was about the demand curve, right? Now we'll move on and we'll talk about the labor supply. What is labor supply? So labor supply is defined as the total number of people who are willing and able to work at different wage rates, right? Now, if you talk about the industry supply of labor, like how many firefighters are there, right? So that would be a total number of people who are able and are willing to work as firefighters. So how many people in Pakistan are trained enough and are willing to work as firefighters? That will determine the supply of firefighters in Pakistan. Similarly, how many singers we have, how many people who are trained as singers or who are capable to sing and are willing to work as singers will determine the total supply of singers in the market. Are you getting me, right? So labor supply is defined as total number of people who are willing and able to work at different wage rates, right? Now, when we show labor supply on a graph, so it's an upward sloping graph. So labor supply is an upward sloping graph like this, right? So higher the wages, higher the quantity of people willing to work, because obviously think about this, if in any occupation you are earning more, so what happens? How do humans decide? So humans decide to work in a certain occupation when they are expected to earn, more wages in that occupation, right? So you have quantity of labor on the x-axis and you have wages on the y-axis. So it will be a normal upward sloping graph like this. So this is supply of labor, right? So if you choose any random point on this, it will show you that, let's say at point A, and then you have point B, and then you have point C, right? So at point A, let's say if the wages are, let's say, $25,000 per year, or whatever, right? So how many people will be willing to work at that wage rate, right? So if the wages being paid to this occupation are 25K per annum, so let's say 100 people are willing to work as singers or firefighters, depending upon which occupation supply we are looking at. And then similarly, at point B, it will show you a different thing, right? So let's say 250 people would be willing to work if, the total, wages rise up to $35,000 per year or whatever, right? Sorry about that. And similarly for the C, right? Okay, now this is the supply of labor. Now, how are wages being determined in the market? That becomes the main question here, because we're talking about wage differential. Now, for Preet, is everything clear? Is there anything that's causing confusion? Now, on this graph, on the same graph, we'll show that why some occupations earn more and why other occupations earn less, right? So in this case, we are comparing two occupations. One is of firefighters and the other one is of singers. So we have wages on the y-axis, like always, and we have quantity of labor on the x-axis, right? After defining what's demand for labor, what's supply of labor, and making their individual graphs, we are moving to the next stage where we are explaining that why some occupations earn more and why other occupations earn less, right? Okay, now here's the first thing. First, you will draw the demand for one occupations. Now, this is where it becomes a little tricky, right? Now, let's think of firefighters. Now, in the case of firefighters, Preet, the idea is that even though firefighting is a very important occupation, it saves lives, it saves human lives, right? But people are not willing to pay that much to firefighters. Why? Because first of all, it's the government that hires firefighters, right? So government's ability to pay to them is not that much, right? So the revenue that these people generate, right? I mean, the revenue that firefighters generate is not that much, because these services are most of the times basic. These are considered as basic facilities and basic services which are provided by the government, and therefore government doesn't charge people a lot for firefighting, right? Are you getting me? Because all these ambulance services and emergency services, rescue services that government provide are considered as basic facilities, and therefore government doesn't charge its citizens a lot of money for that, right? So in long story short, the revenue that these services will generate will not be very much. On the other hand, just imagine now, if there is a very popular singer, right? The revenue that he would generate, on the other hand, the revenue that a singer would generate would be much higher, than so this is the demand curve for singer, because when he conducts a concerts, right, wherever, right, so this hall would be full, the arena, whatever stadium he's performing in, right, would be full of people who have paid price for expensive tickets and so on and so forth, right? So the demand for firefighters, so this is for firefighters, is low compared to the demand for singers. Preet, is this making sense so far? Now let's talk about the supply. Now, if you remember, I did tell you the easier it is to join, right? The easier it is to join an occupation, you will see more supply of people in that occupation. So for supply of labor, the concept is fairly simple. If it's an easier occupation, easier to join, then you see more people in that profession. And if it's difficult to join, you'll see less people in that occupation, right? So which of the two occupations, Preet, do you consider to be relatively more difficult to join? Or in which case it requires more skills and effort to become popular? Yeah, so you have firefighters, right? You have firefighters, and you have singers. Okay, yes, Preet. Okay, now the idea is, think about this. Technically, you might be thinking that, becoming firefighter is more difficult. Yeah, to some extent you're right, because it requires a lot of courage. It requires, extensive training. You have to undergo rigorous training and all that stuff. I totally understand that, right? But if you think about, firefighting is not technically a very skill or, talent oriented thing, right? So any normal human being who learns basic skills, he or she can become a firefighter, right? Not that hard, not that difficult. Obviously, it does require a lot of courage and all that, right? But apart from that, it's not something very difficult or impossible to become. On the other hand, if you think about singers, Preet, so singers need to have a very unique talent. So it's just like asking that what's so unique about Messi and Ronaldo, which other football players don't have. So the answer to that is fairly simple, that they have very unique talent. Obviously, they do train just like other footballers and their colleagues, right, peers, but they have also some inborn talent or inborn ability which makes them good footballers, right, or outstanding, I would say, right? So in this case, since it requires unique talent which is not needed in the case of becoming firefighters, right, therefore we can expect relatively fewer people to fulfill the criteria of being singers. Are you getting me or not, right? So in this case, does not require unique talent. So after knowing this, Preet, for which of the two occupations do you expect the supply to be more? For which of the two occupations would you expect the supply to be more, right? Not much education. In fact, you don't need much education for being a singer, so that cancels each other out, right? Right? Anyone with basic uh, you know, one who is willing to learn can become, to learn the art of firefighting, can become a firefighter. Learn the art of, right? Are you following me? Art of firefighting, fire can become, one, right? Easy, simple, but that's not the case with singers. Okay, now coming back to our previous slide, now have a look at this. Now, I did tell you that the demand for singers would be more because they generate more revenue for the company or wherever they are performing, in terms of the ticket prices and in terms of the ticket that they sell for their concerts and so on and so forth. Whereas the revenue that firefighters generate is not that much. Why? Because it's considered to be a basic basic service which the government is expected to provide free of cost or at very minimal charges. Yes or no, right? So therefore, long story short, firefighters do not generate enough revenue as much as the singers do. Okay. Now moving forward, when we talked about the supply, we saw that firefighters will relatively have more supply. Why would firefighters have more supply? Because I mean, anyone with basic education and basic skill set can develop and learn the skill of firefighting as well, right? So it's no rocket science. Obviously, wherever they are being recruited in that department, they provide them the training, teach them how to become a firefighter, what to do, and things like that, right? So the supply of firefighters is expected to be more compared to the supply of singers. Why? Because singers do require some unique talent, right? Singers do require some unique talent, right? Now, where the supply and demand for singers is equal, right? So have a look at this. I'll put a dot here, right? So this is where the equilibrium for the singers will be. So where the supply and demand for singers is, um, equal to each other. So that will be the supply of singers. You bring this dotted line down and you connect it to the x-axis. So this much quantity of singers will be hired in the market and each singer will be earning this much wage. On the other hand, where the demand for firefighters is equals to the supply of firefighters, so that's where the equilibrium for the firefighters will be. And that is what will show you, that how much will be the wages of firefighters and how much will be the quantity of firefighters. This is making sense, right? So that is what explains the wage differentials. To a large part, that's what explains wage differential between firefighters and singers. Is this making sense? Expect firefighters less than the demand for singers was firefighters generate much work for as organizations cannot customers services basic citizens, right? Is this making sense? Okay. Now moving on, this being said, on the other hand, singers generate revenue for the companies, for either themselves if they're doing it, or we can say revenue for companies they are hired by, because the concert ticket prices increases are huge, and therefore demand for singles is much more than demand for firefighters, right? And that's exactly what we showed on our graph, right? Okay, now this being said, moving on, uh, right? Okay, now this being said, moving on, similarly, you'll explain that why supply of singers is less and supply of firefighters more. Then supply, then why supply of singers is more than supply of firefighters, right? And in this, what would you say? Becoming singer requires dealing with more people can possess, therefore there are expected less singers than firefighters, which basic education and skills can become, right? Okay, so after you have explained that why, you know, uh, after you've explained that why you expect the demand for singers to be more and the supply of singers to be less compared to firefighters, then you will explain, then you will make this graph that we did to show that the supply since the supply is less of firefighters and demand is more, the overall wages would be higher for singers compared to firefighters, right? So this is what explains wage differential. But the answer doesn't end over here, right? Then towards the end of your answer, you also need to explain, Preet, that what could be some other factors that explain the differential. What could be some other factors that could explain the differential? So just to give you a quick idea, just to give you a quick idea, I mean, you can talk about wage elasticity. Remember, we discussed this in the classes, other factors that affect wages, occupations, right? So one would be wage elasticity of labor demand and labor supply, right? Wage elasticity of labor demand and labor supply. Then it could be, uh, right? Wage elasticity of labor demand and labor supply. What else? Wage discrimination would not really be affected here, right? Then it depends on, uh, yeah, yeah, I think that that's one more factor that would be enough in this case, right? Now let's quickly do a recap of what wage elasticity of labor demand and labor supply was, right? That will give you a better idea. Okay. Now, wage elasticity of labor demand and labor supply, apart from the main factor, which was demand and supply, so you have to explain that in a lot of detail, like the way we did, because this is the main factor that determine differential, that determine why some occupations earn more and other occupations earn less. But apart from that, there's one more factor that's important in determining the wage differential, and that's known as wage elasticity, wage elasticity of labor demand, wage elasticity of labor demand and labor supply. Wage elasticity of labor demand, wage elasticity of labor demand and labor supply. Okay, now let's first talk about wage elasticity of labor demand. Now, what is wage elasticity of labor demand, right? So wage elasticity of labor demand means that how much will be the change in quantity demanded of labor, right? So how much will be the change in quantity demanded for labor due to change in wages, right? So just like any other case of elasticity, which can be more elastic and less elastic, similarly in this case as well, either the labor demand would be more elastic or less elastic. Now, what do we mean by more elastic? More elastic means that it's easier to substitute a certain type of occupation with machines. Preet, are you following me? So wage elasticity of labor demand basically shows that how much easy or difficult would it be to replace a certain type of occupation with wage elasticity of labor demand with machines. Now, if you think about singers, I mean, technically it's impossible to, because that's what an entertainer means, right? So entertainer, singer, right? I mean, it's the very uniqueness of the voice, and it's very uniqueness of the words, the lyrics or music or whatever you want to call it, that determines the demand for singers, right? So if they have that unique talent of singing and making unique music and lyrics, that's what helps them earn more, right? So you can't replace them with any machine or anything artificial, yes or no, right? But on the other hand, if you think about firefighting, in the case of firefighting, you can develop a lot of advanced machines. You must have seen, in fact, they are being used in some developed countries, where there is a car that comes in and the building which has caught fire, so there are stairs, and then the machine crane sort of a thing, it goes up and then it throws water or whatever and things like that, right? Are you getting? So that's what advanced technology can do to firefighting, because if that advanced technology gets developed, which is in the process, then you would not need physical, you don't need a lot of human beings to do the firefighting. In fact, the machines can do it for you. On the other hand, that doesn't work for singers. So you would say that the demand for firefighters is more elastic and the demand for singers is less elastic. So even if wages for singers is increasing, people don't mind paying them more, because singers cannot be replaced with what? Singers cannot be replaced with machines, whereas firefighters can be replaced with machines, right? So singers, less elastic, cannot be replaced with machines, whereas firefighters can be replaced with uh, machines, right? So that's the idea. And for firefighters, you would say it's more elastic. Firefighters, firefighters, it's more elastic, right? Easy. We're good on this. Okay. Now moving on, it's more. Okay. Now moving on, let's talk about the wage elasticity of labor supply. Now, what is wage elasticity of labor supply? Wage elasticity of labor supply shows that how much will be the change in supply of the labor, how much will be the change in the supply of labor due to change in wages of the occupation. Wage elasticity of labor supply. So just like wage elasticity of labor demand shows that how much was the change in demand for labor due to change in their wages, wage elasticity of labor supply shows how much will be the change in supply of labor due to change in wages. Wage elasticity of uh, labor supply. Just a second. Wage elasticity of labor supply, right? Okay, now think about this. So how much will be the change in supply of labor? Percentage change change of second percentage change in quantity supplied of labor due to change in labor due to change in wages, right? Okay. Again, the idea here is that either the wage elasticity of labor supply be more elastic or less elastic. Now, what does it mean to be more elastic? More elastic means that whenever wages increase, there will be greater increase in supply of labor. Whenever the wages increase, there will be greater supply in in the supply of that occupation. Preet, are you following me? Now think about this. If you think of firefighting, as I explained to you, that firefighting, becoming a firefighter is not too much of a talent, right? So anyone who is willing to learn with basic education can become a firefighter, right? Whereas that's not the case with the singers. So everyone in the world knows that singers earn so much, but do you see still a lot of singers? Why? Because it's not that easy unless, until and unless your music is not liked by people out there and they don't find it very amusing or very interesting or fascinating, then they will not follow you, they will not buy your albums, they will not come to your concerts, they will not watch your YouTube videos and all that stuff, right? So long story short, you can think of singers, wage elasticity of supply to be less elastic. Why? Because even if wages increase, you will not see a lot of influx in the singing industry, because given the fact that becoming one is not that easy. On the other hand, if you increase the wages of firefighters, more people will be interested in becoming one, because I mean, it's not something which is very difficult to become or very difficult to learn. Right? It's just some basic training that you have to undergo and you can become a firefighter. Right? Okay. Now, after we know that both the supply and the demand for firefighters is less elastic. I repeat myself. Now, after knowing, Preet, that the demand and supply of both firefighters will be less elastic compared to what? Compared to singers. Sorry, the wage elasticity of demand and wage elasticity of supply of singers will be less elastic compared to firefighters. Now we will remake the graph, demand and supply graph that we made earlier, to show that how the wages between two occupations will be different, right? So you will have quantity of labor on the x-axis, you will have quantity of labor on the x-axis, and you will have wages on the y-axis. Now think about this. Now, firstly, making about the demand. So you will make the demand for singers to be higher than firefighters and less elastic. How do we know that this demand curve, this is for the firefighters and this is for the firefighters, and the other one is for singers. Now, think about this. Now, this is the demand for singers. So singers demand is higher than firefighters, and it's more inelastic because it's steep. We do know that when the demand curve is steep, that's inelastic. Similarly, when the supply curve is steep, that's less elastic or inelastic, right? Now, that is how you draw the demand curves of the two occupations. For the singers demand curve, it's higher, right? And it's also steep compared to the demand for firefighters. Now, moving on to the supply, have a look at this. Supply of singers would be less, and it would be supply of singers would be less, and it will be again inelastic. Why? Because as I told you, that it's not easy to become a singer. Supply of singers is inelastic. Just like demand, the supply of singers is also inelastic. So supply of singers will be inelastic, and therefore it will be a steep graph like this. It will be a steep graph like this. Easy? We're good on this? Okay. Now, talking about the supply of firefighters, the supply of firefighters will be more. The supply of firefighters will be more, and it would be the supply of firefighters would be more, and it would be to the right of the supply of, what is that called? Singers, because it's easier to become a singer. Sorry, it's easier to become a firefighter rather than a singer. So here comes the supply of firefighters, right? Now, is this making sense? Now, where the supply of firefighters is equal to the demand for firefighters. Are you following me? So that's the point where the equilibrium in the firefighting would be, right? Okay, now this is the point where the two are equal, right? So this is the point. So at this point, you can see that this much quantity of firefighters would be hired in the market. So QF, you label it as QF, and this is the wages that they will earn. And these are the wages that they will earn, right? So wages of firefighters. Fire firefighters, right? And then if you look at the equilibrium in the singers market, so that's where the supply and demand for singers intersect. So you bring this dotted line down and you label and you connect it with the x-axis, and that will show you the quantity of singers that will be hired in the market and how much wages will each singer earn. So you can clearly see for yourself that yes, less singers will be hired in the market, because as you can see for yourself that there are not many singers in any country compared to the number of firefighters that they have, because obviously firefighters being a crucial basic service, everyone needs it, right? There are much more people in the country, and therefore, with regards to that, you need a lot of firefighters. But as far as singers are concerned, it's a very unique talent and skill. Not You will not see a lot of singers in that country, right? So that being said, the quantity of singers is much lesser than the quantity of firefighters in any country. But if you look at the wages, so singers are earning much more. The wage differential between firefighters and singers is huge, right? That's the idea. Easy, Preet? Okay, so let's stop here for today, and tomorrow we'll do another question. Is there any confusion, Preet? Anything that you did not understand? Anything you want to ask me? Right? So let's stop here for today, and tomorrow we'll continue from here. Right? Okay. Thank you. See you. Bye. Take care. Have a good day.